I want to talk to you about the best podcast players for your website this year, okay? And so here's the overview I want you to think about. First of all, I want to define what a podcast player really is. So, in its most basic form, it's actually a play button for a particular podcast episode. Really pretty straightforward, nothing really complicated there, okay? It's one of those things where if you want to add an extra layer of capability to your podcast, you might want to think about a podcast host, okay? And so every podcaster has access to podcast players via their hosting account, and published episodes will have a few share options, one of which will be a player embed code. And you want to really pay attention to that embed code because that's actually your key to accessibility here. Third party or standalone podcast players are available too. And if you don't like the default native or one that your hosting provider gives you, okay? So here's a list I want you to think about. So what are the best native podcast players here? First, you have Captivate. And when you think about Captivate, I want you to think about one of the most reliable and innovative media hosting services that actually we have tried. And their player is actually fully responsive on any device. So that's kind of cool in terms of if you want scalability right off the bat, actually Captivate has that. And you have the buttons are also available. You have buttons underneath the play bar so that you can actually you can share your content with your audience real fast. And Captivate Podcast Player features has tools such as speed and skip controls. So that's kind of cool in terms of flexibility. You have follow, subscribe options. You have social sharing. This is another great possibility. You also have a page of custom links. So you have the possibility to actually transcribe things real fast. And you also have call to action button. Okay, so the CTA button is pretty important. Plus, if you sign up for actually their affiliate program, the Captivate link in the window is an affiliate link that you will see on all your podcast let's say pages. Okay, Captivate's podcast player offers a straightforward way to share your show, expand on the episode with your show notes, and actually include affiliate marketing. So not much to complain about here. So you have a lot of flexibility. If you're thinking about the best podcast players for your website, think about Buzzsprout. And Buzzsprout's player is like their hosting, is great looking, feature rich, and a lovely user experience. And Buzzsprout does a lot of things when it comes to UX and UI. We have actually we've covered Buzzsprout on another show, so you might want to think about that show, at least watch that show. But the thing is that with Buzzsprout, you have a lot of flexibility. The single episode player has two styles: wave, which shows the waveform, and minimal, which actually shows the episode's show notes, which is more expensive than minimal. But Buzzsprout didn't ask, they don't ask you if you want what kind of option you want. You have to really you have to activate the process yourself. And if you enable monetization for your podcast, your player actually can include a donation link too. So what are the Buzzsprout podcast player features? Well, you have playback speed and skip controls. So that's kind of cool in terms of helping your listener experience. You have a chapter list. So Buzzsprout does a great job in terms of categorizing your podcast. You have a button to show the show notes. You have a social sharing also, so that's kind of cool in terms of expanding the link. Let's say expanding the shelf life of your content. And you also have, as I said earlier, you have a donation button, so you can connect to Patreon, PayPal, Buy Me a Coffee, and more. So you have a lot of possibilities there. Buzzsprout's podcast player doesn't show all of these options until users glide their mouse over the player to make the symbols appear. Okay, users have to click on the options to find out what the symbols mean. This might be why most people don't know how feature-rich this player is, and I think it's a great one, especially if you are trying to have a podcast player embedded in your podcast. And it doesn't matter if you are an experienced podcaster or you are a novice. You can actually use Buzzsprout across the board. So that's really fantastic. I love it a lot. you're thinking about the best podcast players for your website, think about Transistor. And Transistor is actually a great, versatile, and affordable media hosting option. And podcast player options include multi-episode, single episode, and most recent episode. So this trifecta really adds an extra layer of variety, but also accessibility for your show. Okay, and so this is actually great for when your show is mentioned in someone else's roundup or on their website, so that you are able to actually direct traffic back and forth from your own digital assets. And what happens here is that with Transistor, your content stays fresh, even if they never update the article. I was talking about you being mentioned in someone else's roundup or on the website. Okay, so what are the key podcast player features to expect rather if you were to go with Transistor this year? Well, you have a playback speed and skip controls. So I love that a lot, and you are gonna love it because having the ability to give enable your listeners to play back and also skip is really fantastic. You have follow and subscribe options. You have also social sharing. You have a share button with customizable start time, so that's really fantastic. And you also have the more info, and that's a button that takes you to the show notes. And when it comes to the show notes, that's where you can actually increase more. You can actually include more content to increase the SEO of your show, right? Because the show notes, and we actually, I have an entire show on the show notes, the importance of having show notes, because show notes are going to give more context, more granularity, more thoroughness, if you will, to your show. And this is also a great place to actually instill an extra layer of SEO, search engine optimization, to your show, so that you can actually be let's say, more discoverable. Okay, not only through Google, but also through Bing, through Yahoo, but also other third-party podcast directories such as Apple and Spotify. By the way. I want to talk to you about Libsyn. When you think about the best podcast players for your website this year, think about Libsyn. And what I love about Libsyn, and what you're going to love about Libsyn, is that Libsyn has a proven track record. Libsyn is not a rookie. Libsyn is not actually a new kid on the block. The company has been around for a while, and over the years, they've actually developed a certain expertise when it comes to podcast players. Okay. And during COVID, as a matter of fact, like the last 3 to 4 years ago, when COVID struck, Libsyn actually took some time to actually beef up their platform's value. Again, they came up with new capabilities, new modules, and so on and so forth. So Libsyn actually is one of the longest running players in the podcast games. Okay, and the company's commitment to podcasting education and audio quality makes it stand out big time. But its embedded player was bare bones for so long, it was almost retro. And when Libsyn 5 came along, the company actually updated their embedded player to keep pace with its media hosting peers. So that's really fantastic. Now, what are the podcast player features you can actually see within Libsyn? Well, you have playback speed and skip controls. You have follow, subscribe options. So that's really good in terms of helping you expand your listener base. You have social sharing. So basically, you're able to share your content via the likes of Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, Pinterest, and so on and so forth. Okay. You also have customizable start time and colors. So Libsyn really gives you a lot of granularity there. So we love that aspect of things a lot, especially when it comes to scaling big time. So that's really good. And also within Libsyn, if you want to use Libsyn as a podcast player, you can assign a stats tracking code. So you basically will know what kind of traffic the player generates, especially if you are interested in the geography of that traffic. Basically, Libsyn will help you big time. I want to talk to you about Blueberry. When you think about the best podcast players for your website, I want you to really consider this provider a lot. I mean, Blueberry actually is really great because they have all kinds of capabilities, especially the company's new Blueberry web player. And this is a player. This is a web player that offers closed captioning for its hosting customers. The transcript opens up in a window below the player with a box you can uncheck if you don't want to, or if you want to have a auto scroll. So Blueberry actually has done a lot of work, also especially during COVID as well, by updating its platform big time. So the new web player is actually great for a lot of reasons. You have flexibility, you have scalability, and you have efficiency too. And if you host with Blueberry or are thinking of joining them, then you might want to skip down to the Power Price section. Blueberry owns Power Price, and if you actually have a self-hosted WordPress website, you can use Power Price as your embedded audio player, and this can actually do wonders for your content when it comes to accessibility. So, what are the Blueberry podcast player features here? You have a playback speed and a skip controls, so that's kind of cool in terms of efficiency. You're gonna love that. You have a follow, subscribe options. You have social sharing. You have a closed captions, and that's part of the transcription. Now, Blueberry is a little, it's not as let's say, sophisticated as what you have with Libsyn, that's for sure. But Blueberry does a great job when it comes to transcription. I mean, their closed captions are pretty reliable. I mean, I tested it, and our team tested it several times, and actually, the closed caption came out pretty strong. So you can actually rely on Blueberry for closed captions, and this is cool because you have they have an element of AI transcription process that really help you that really help the program recognize context and also the context from content. So that's really good. If you're looking for the best podcast players for your website, I want you to think about Red Circle. And Red Circle is another big player that I love a lot and that you're going to love also, because Red Circle does a great job in terms of helping you facilitate the podcast advertiser relationship. This is important, especially if you are trying to monetize either in the short run or in the long run your podcast. You know, monetizing not just through advertising, but also through sponsoring, through brand deals, and so on and so forth. And Red Circle actually makes it very easy for podcasters to run shows with ads. And the company also makes it very easy for businesses to advertise on podcasts. So this is kind of cool, especially when it comes to having the money flow for, I mean, you know, the cash inflows and cash outflows for your podcast. And so what we love about Red Circle is that it does a great job at making sure that folks can advertise on podcasts, because the player doesn't have a skip button. However, listeners can still drag the playhead along if they don't want to sit through an ad. So they give a lot of flexibility. So what are Red Circle podcast player features that you can really rely on this year? Well, you have a playback speed, so that's kind of cool. So you don't have the skip control, okay? You don't have it. I think I just said it a little earlier. You have a follow, subscribe options. You have social sharing. What you're gonna love is that Red Circle has a more comprehensive list of social media where you can actually share your podcast this year. You also have the view episode feature, and that feature actually takes you to show notes. So no wonder the show notes are pretty important within Red Circle. I explained to you a little earlier why show notes can be prominent for your content, not only from an SEO perspective, but also from a granularity point of view. And also, if you are a Red Circle Pro user, you can customize the colors of the podcast player. So this can actually be important for you if you focus a lot on branding in your podcast, and you want to really you want to match the colors of the podcast player to the brand of your podcast. If you're thinking about the best podcast players for your website, I want you to think about Podbean. And Podbean is actually a veteran hosting company with the added bonus of having a free tier and a bunch of options for advertising and monetization. And the company's podcast player offers customizable sizes and colors, along with the usual stuff you will know to expect by now, right? So, in terms of Podbean podcast player features, you have playback speed, follow, subscribe options, social sharing, and also you're all able to customize the size and colors of the player. So, I just gave you the 7 best podcast players for your website this year, right? Let me talk to you a little bit about the extras. When you think about podcast players, you have 2 kinds of podcast players, really. So, to the casual web surfer, there may not appear to be much of a difference in podcast players. For podcasters, though, there is a distinction that affects what you can do with the player itself. There are standalone WordPress plugins and native podcast players. So I just taking a look at native podcast players, right? They come by default with your media hosting account. Your host generates a chunk of code that you copy and paste. You can embed this in a blog post, and voila, pretty straightforward. Nothing really complicated here. Embedding embedding a native podcast player works on Squarespace, Wix, and many other website builders. They offer more flexibility than a WordPress plugin, but not as many features. Now, standalone WordPress plugins work on a self-hosted WordPress site, and these little nuggets of software offer more options than native players. So that's an important element to think about. So when you think about standalone podcast player plugins, you have to really think about Fusebox, for instance. Now, Fusebox was formerly called a Smart Podcast Player, okay? And Fusebox, actually, the Fusebox Podcast Player and Transcript tool is meant for podcasters who want to make their show accessible and drive traffic to a specific location. Sure, audiences can enjoy your podcast in their favorite listening app, but with a Fusebox Podcast Player, your podcast episodes can match up with other online content, providing more value for each. So that's kind of cool. And the sticky player lets users listen to the podcast player actually while navigating between pages too. So that's kind of cool. And so Fusebox also now includes podcast hosting, making it a strong competitor to the native options that I just listed for you a little earlier. So Fusebox's full podcast player has a customizable call to action button, email capture, speed control, custom colors, custom episode sorting, featured episodes, light and dark modes, mobile-friendly adjustments, and Fusebox's single episode player has a playback speed adjustment, volume control, customizable call to action button, and links to find your podcast in different apps. So that's really fantastic. Next, you have a simple podcast price. And so when you think about simple podcast price, I want you to think about a plugin created by a great entrepreneur in the name of Hani Mora, which is actually a long time, who is actually a long time supporter of the podcast community. And so simple podcast price is all about growth, providing a bunch of tools to increase subscriptions and engagement. It also extends a little outside the player experience, adding a range of unique features that actually ramp up the user experience on your show notes themselves. So you have a lead magnet style email sign up for you to increase conversions, subscribe and share links right up front, play skip. You have play speed, skip, and volume controls built in. You have a link to various hosting platforms and automate show notes publishing. You have a show's podcast reviews inside your WordPress dashboard. So that's kind of cool. You're able to create clickable episode timestamps, which actually skip to that point in the episode. You have a collapsible transcripts. You can include the transcript without cluttering your show notes page. And you can include your own custom call to action buttons right inside the player. So that's kind of cool. And finally, the extra features are actually the icing on the cake, from clickable timestamps to the ability to create tweetable quotes from your show. Okay. So this is kind of cool. And so Simple Podcast Price actually is as fully featured as it gets when it comes to increasing the growth of your audience and moving them through your funnel. So that's really fantastic. You also have a Power Price. So Blueberry contribution to the standalone podcast player plugin game is actually Power Price. And what makes this WordPress plugin different is that your podcast episode files are hosted by Blueberry, not but by your they're not actually they're hosted by Blueberry, but your RSS feed is under your URL. You manage your podcast from your WordPress dashboard instead of logging into a Blueberry. This is great if you want to manage your website and your podcast for that matter in an online spot instead of logging into a different services. This is kind of cool. So when it comes to choosing a podcast player, you have to really know what your needs are, right? Like almost every question in podcasting, the answer to your podcast, to what podcast player should you choose is it really depends. If you're not really a pushing email list or a sales funnel, then use the native player from your media hosting service. There is nothing to download or set up. The code loads quickly. You don't have to pay for it. Anything else, pretty straightforward. But if you are running a business, you need a player with more features. Simple Podcast Press helps you lead your audience to different locations in your site. The Fusebox player is also great for panache. It's one of those things where you have to see what works for you and what doesn't work for you, especially in the long run. This is an important element to think about. So in closing arguments into this conversation, I spoke to you about the best podcast players for your website. I give you the overview and the extras. So in terms of overview, we have the overview. I also talked to you about the list, by the way. So the list I spoke to you about Captivate, Buzzsprout, Transistor, Libsyn, Blueberry. You also have a Red Circle and Podbean. And you also have other players in terms of extras. You have Fusebox, Simple Podcast Press, and also PowerPress. Thank you so much. God bless you. I'll see you next time. Until then, remember, stay marvelous.